Hi, I'm Nadia, and welcome to Hidden History, where I'm telling you some stories about World War II that you may never have heard before. And today I'm going to tell you about the epic escape of over 100,000 Poles who had been doomed to a slow death in Stalin's penal camps, the Gulag. I've described the horrendous conditions in the Gulag in other videos, so please watch them if you haven't seen them already. My story today begins in 1939, when Hitler had signed a secret pact with Stalin to jointly invade Poland and divide the territory between them. On the 17th of September, which is the day when the Soviet Union invaded East Poland, my father was an officer in the Polish army, and he had been fighting in the city of Lwów in southeast Poland when the army was given orders to evacuate through the border with Hungary or Romania, because the army was simply unable to fight two enemies on both fronts. Now, because of his proximity to the Hungarian border on that day, my father was one of the lucky ones who managed to escape. But I'm sure that the order to evacuate must have been really anguishing for him, because his hometown was slightly southwest of Lwów, and I have no doubt that as he evacuated, he would have seen signposts to that town, knowing that he was leaving his family there defenseless against two brutal enemies invading his country. Now, there were about 200,000 other Polish troops who were further away from the borders that couldn't escape in time, and they were arrested by the Soviets and put into either prisoner of war camps or sent to hard labor camps in Siberia. As you'll know from my other videos, there was no escape from Stalin's Gulag, which is why it's such an incredible story that the Poles managed to evacuate an entire army out of the Soviet Union. So today, that's what this video is about. How did they do that? And the pivotal event that brought about this incredible reprieve for the captured Polish troops was Operation Barbarosa. In June 1941, Hitler tore up his secret pact with Stalin and launched an invasion of the Soviet Union. German troops poured across the Soviet-occupied region of eastern Poland and penetrated into the Soviet Union itself. This invasion caught Stalin completely off guard. By the end of that year, Stalin was facing catastrophic losses. He had lost 4 million troops who were either killed or taken prisoner, and Germany had taken a staggering 500,000 square miles of Soviet territory. So Stalin needed to enlist more men into his army to replace them, and fast. And of course he had a ready supply of manpower in the Gulag camps. In 1941 alone, he released more than 400,000 Gulag prisoners to fight at the front against Germany. This was almost a quarter of the entire population of Gulag prisoners. In the most ferocious battles of all of World War II, 34 million Soviet soldiers fought in the meat grinder of the Eastern Front against Germany. For the men recruited from the Gulag, it was a stark choice between a quick death at the front or a slow death in a labor camp. Many of the prisoners chose to fight, and some of them survived. A strong motivator for them to enlist was to get food. Food shortages were aggravated by the fact that the Soviets destroyed their own grain fields in Ukraine so that the crops couldn't be used by the enemy army. And moreover, as the war progressed, food supplies were prioritized for the army fighting at the front, and this caused even more severe food shortages for the Gulag prisoners and also civilians, and millions of them starved to death during the war. Stalin's invasion had made him a sworn enemy of Poland in 1939, and yet less than 2 years later, the Polish president Władysław Sikorski signed an agreement of mutual friendship with Stalin. And the reason that happened is because Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union was a game changer in the war, which forced Stalin to forge new alliances with Great Britain and also with Poland. So the Polish president was able to persuade Stalin to release the Polish prisoners from the Gulag in order to form an army that would fight against Hitler. The man that would lead this army is pictured here, standing on Sikorski's right, Władysław Anders. Anders had himself been arrested in September 1939 and put into a notorious Soviet prison called the Lubyanka in Moscow. This was the headquarters of the NKVD, or secret police, and it was well known for the brutal methods of torture that were used on the prisoners. Expecting that he would be executed, Anders couldn't believe his luck to be released from the prison, let alone to be told that he would be forming a new army. But his task was fraught with difficulties, as we'll see. Production quotas in the Gulag increased as Stalin went on a war footing, and massive numbers of tanks and armaments needed to be produced at speed. So the Gulag prisoners had to work harder and harder with less and less food. And a quarter of the Gulag population was wiped out in 1941, mainly from starvation. So as a result, many Gulag commanders didn't inform the Polish prisoners that they were eligible for release because they needed to still meet their production quotas. The upshot was that only a small fraction of them were actually released and reached freedom. But miraculously, my grandmother and 2 uncles were among the lucky ones, and I'll tell you their stories another time. From August 1941, recruitment into Anders' army began over here in the west of the Soviet Union, in these recruitment centres, which for orientation were just southeast of Moscow, which was up here. And the reason for this location in the west of the Soviet Union was that enlistment initially began from prisoner of war camps that were located in the west. So about 25,000 Polish troops were being held in prisoner of war camps. And this was only a small fraction of the 200,000 Polish troops that had been captured by the Soviets. So the others had either been murdered, died of cold and starvation, or had been shipped out to hard labour camps in the eastern part of Siberia. Now, when these prisoners were released from the Gulag, the camp officials issued them with identity papers, and these were essential in order for them to travel within the Soviet Union. Some of the prisoners received assistance with transport. They were given railway tickets, and they also received daily food rations. But this was very sketchy, and others received no such assistance. They had to fend for themselves. And those deported to the furthest outposts of Siberia obviously faced the most perilous journeys. And in particular, the men who were sent to the notorious metal mines in the Kolyma region faced a walk of hundreds of miles to reach the nearest seaport in Magadan. And from there, they would board a slave ship that would take them back down here to Vladivostok, from where they could catch a train on the Trans-Siberian Railway, which would take them all the way west to the enlistment centres. That was a journey of about 6,000 miles on the train alone. And you'll know from my other videos that conditions on those trains were pretty appalling. There was no sanitation, not very much food or water, and the journey lasted for weeks. Hundreds of people died en route. In other locations, men were able to build rafts out of logs, and they used them to float downriver towards the recruitment centres. Obviously, that was pretty dangerous too. So, all in all, thousands of men, an unknown number because nobody knows where their graves are, thousands of men died en route, simply trying to reach Anders enlistment camps, starving from the lack of food, succumbing to disease, or simply freezing to death before they got there. General Anders, the commander of the new Polish army, insisted that they must enlist at these Polish recruitment centres. And he did this to prevent his men from being sent directly to the slaughter of the Soviet front line, like Stalin's other Gulag prisoners. These photographs show men enlisting at the centre in Totskoy. There was another centre at Buzulak, where Anders had his headquarters. At these and other army camps, 3 infantry divisions were formed. While Stalin agreed not to send the Poles directly to the front, this created logistic problems for Anders, because Stalin wouldn't provide them with the same food rations, uniforms, or equipment that were provided to the men at the front. The number of recruits enlisting rapidly swelled to 70,000 people, but there were only rations for less than half of them. And the quality of the food was also poor. Bread, potatoes, gruel, soup, and maybe a little meat every few days. The lack of food and equipment made it impossible for the men to regain their strength and train effectively. The recruits arriving at Anders' camps were in appalling condition, near starvation and dressed in lice-infected rags. Many of the soldiers were still wearing the remnants of the Polish uniforms they were wearing when they were captured 2 years earlier. Only a quarter of the men even had shoes. During the brutally cold winter of 1941 to 42, most of these recruits had to live in canvas tents. Some froze to death as the temperatures fell to -50 degrees. Before long, as you can imagine, acrimonious exchanges broke out between Anders and Stalin over the shortage of food, equipment, and adequate accommodation for his men. The British government stepped in by shipping 100,000 winter uniforms, which included greatcoats and boots, which you can see in the photo on the right. These were absolutely essential for survival in the extreme cold. Because the primitive living conditions were intolerable in Russia, Anders decided to relocate his army south, where the climate would at least be more tolerable. Then, he reasoned, his men would be able to recover from their ordeal in Siberia and regain their strength. So in January 1942, he set up his new headquarters in Jangi-Yul, a military camp near Tashkent in Uzbekistan, which was also a part of the Soviet Union. The journey of 1,200 miles across Kazakhstan took about 6 days by train. Anders was followed south to Uzbekistan by his soldiers travelling on special trains. But some of these men were in such poor health after their ordeal in Siberia that this long train journey was simply too much for them, and they died en route. But new recruits were also joining the army every day. And this photo was taken during training exercises in the hills around Jangi-Yul in 1942. And you can see Anders seated here wearing dark glasses. In addition to the men enlisting in his army, there were also a large number of Polish women and children who were flocking to join the army. And so Anders created the Women's Auxiliary Division. This was their only hope of survival. In addition, the number of infantry divisions grew from 3 to 6, along with other army formations. The number of Poles under Anders' care grew to over 100,000. And in Tashkent, the climate was less harsh than it had been in Russia, but they now faced another problem. Epidemics of typhus and dysentery tore through Anders' overcrowded camps. There were no medical provisions because everything had been diverted to the Soviet front. Hundreds, maybe thousands more Poles died in the camps around Tashkent. Some accounts describe dead bodies lying in ditches along the roadside. Anders had no choice but to relocate his army again. And in March 1942, he met with Stalin in person to resolve the situation. And the situation was ultimately resolved through the intervention of the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He persuaded Stalin that the Polish army, which was still too weak to be able to fight, should be exchanged for Soviet soldiers who were serving in Iran at that time. Stalin agreed to evacuate the Poles to Iran, where they would then come under the care of the British authorities. There were 2 large evacuations. From the end of March to early April, about 45,000 troops and civilians made another arduous journey by train. This was about 1,200 miles again over 5 or 6 days west to a port on the Caspian Sea called Turkmenbashi. This first evacuation was followed by the remaining recruits in June and July, and in total 116,000 Poles were evacuated to safety out of the Soviet Union. People travelling on this train were in terrible physical condition. Many of them were suffering from typhus, dysentery, diarrhea, and malaria. So whenever the train stopped, dead bodies were unloaded and left by the railway tracks. And even once they got to Turkmenbashi, the sea crossing to Iran would prove to be another horrific ordeal. This photo shows troops leaving the Soviet Union in the second evacuation in June 1942. All manner of ships, from oil tankers to coal barges, were used to ship the Poles to Iran. And these ships clearly were not suited to carry large numbers of passengers as they did. There was no provision of food or water on board during the 5-day crossing, and the number of toilets was also woefully inadequate, especially considering the extent of the overcrowding you can see in this picture, but also because a large number of these passengers were suffering with poor health, having dysentery and diarrhea, and I'm sure you can imagine the consequences of that. Conditions on the ships were absolutely terrible. Horrible unsanitary conditions, which you can read about in graphic detail online. And more people died during the sea crossing. But for those who made it to Iran, they finally found freedom and medical care. In all, Anders managed to evacuate 116,000 Poles out of Siberia to freedom, which is quite an astonishing accomplishment. Of these, 74,000 were soldiers, and the rest were women and children. This Polish army went on to fight with great heroism in the war, and I'll tell you about their accomplishments in another video. But Anders never forgot that they left behind another 1.5 million Poles who were not released from the Gulag, and their fate weighed heavily on his mind, and also that of the Polish President Sikorski. Upon their arrival in Iran, their British overseers forbade the Poles from speaking about the horrific conditions they had endured in Stalin's Gulag. The reason for this gag order? It was because Britain didn't want to jeopardize its newfound military alliance with Stalin against Hitler. This implicit threat of retaliation against the remaining captives in the Gulag was used to enforce the gag order for the remainder of the war. And to this day, that's why most people living in the West know nothing about this story. Next time, I'll tell you how my 70-year-old grandmother reached Iran and what happened to her after that. I hope you learned something new from this video. Please give me a like below and subscribe to my channel so you can check out my other videos. And thank you so much for watching.